As we learned in the first lecture, people have been drawing lines and shapes for a very long time, at least 80,000 years. It's also the way most of us started drawing as kids. It comes pretty naturally, so it's a logical place to begin. We'll start by learning about two kinds of line, contour line and construction line. Then we'll see how we can use them to draw simple shapes. By combining contour and construction line and shape, we can draw all kinds of things, including the kinds of things commonly found in still lifes. We'll finish up by talking about a special kind of shape, aggregate shape, and how we can use it to help us organize the various shapes associated with the objects in a drawing. You'll need pencils, erasers, sharpening tools, a T-square, triangle, a ruler, and a drawing board. We'll also use a bunch of paper, so 8.5 by 11-inch printer paper or similar sized sketchbook would be fine. You'll also need a table positioned against a wall and some objects, a simple bottle like a wine bottle among them. Other useful objects would be things like a pitcher, a vase, candlesticks, coffee mugs, wine glasses, and the like. This is one of the drawings we looked at in the first lecture. It's by the great 19th century American artist and teacher Thomas Eakins. It's a study for his 1873 watercolor John Biglin in a Single Skull. This drawing uses many types of lines, including the two we're discussing here, contour and construction line. We'll start with contour. I'd like you to draw three shapes, a circle, a rectangle, and a triangle. Do it now. To draw the circle, most of you probably put your pencil's tip on the page and made a more or less continuous line. You started at a certain point, and then, without crossing back over the line you'd drawn, you'd return to that point of origin along a continuous curve. Most of that would constitute a reasonable set of instructions for making a shape of any kind. Put your pencil's tip on your page. Don't lift the pencil from the page. Draw a line in any or all directions. Don't cross over any line you've drawn, and then return to that point of origin. The kind of line you've used here is called contour. It's often used to describe the outer edge of something. In Eakins' drawing of John Biglin, a lot of the figure is defined by contour. Note that line starting at the top of the head, the one that continues back along the back of his skull. It's really not that much different than the portion of the circle you just drew. The long line describing Biglin's back and the lines which define the top edges of his arms, those are also contours. And, as you may have already noticed, the reflection in the water contains a lot of contour too. Contour is the primary type of line we use to outline shapes. And it's a type of line you just use to draw your circle, rectangle, and triangle. We also find construction line in Eakins' drawing. It's also referred to as diagrammatic line. I'm sure you noticed the many ruled radiating lines on the river's surface. You may have guessed that these are perspectival construction lines. Eakins uses them to better understand the plane of the surface of the water. These lines will also help him figure out the relative spacing and relative size of any ripples or wavelets he introduces on the water's surface. The lines help Eakins draw the things he wants to draw. But the lines themselves aren't going to make it into the final watercolor. Construction lines are often like scaffolding at a construction site. It helps the workers build a building, but as a project moves toward completion, it's removed. Going back to Eakins' drawing, you've also likely noticed the strong central vertical. That drawing is actually made on two pieces of paper joined in the center. And this may have been reiterated with line as well. In any case, this vertical helps Eakins pin the rower dead center in the page, and this central construction line helps him keep the reflection vertically aligned with the subject reflected. It's like a guide, like the lines painted on the highway that tell you where to steer your car. We also use construction shapes. Those are shapes that help us draw something. Some people use construction lines and shapes instinctively, and in fact, you may have used them to draw your circle. Drawing a decent circle isn't easy, but try it starting with a construction shape, a square. Cross the diagonals, then extend a vertical and a horizontal through the center point to the square's edges. You could also add a diamond by connecting the center points of the square's sides. These are all construction lines and shapes. Now, like Eakins, you know where to locate your subject, right here inside your construction shape. And you've given yourself 5 guide points, 4 along the perimeter and 1 in the center. If you pass through each of the 4 outside points, like in a connect the dots drawing, while staying equidistant from the center point, You'll have given yourself a real leg up in getting a good circle. You'll also notice you have 4 distinct quadrants as you draw your circle, and you can compare the curvature in each one. You can measure the curvature against each of the diagonals of the internal diamond too. Now, most of us tend to do better in one quadrant than another, so now we can compare them and bring each quadrant up to the quality of the best one. You may find it helpful to rotate your paper as you draw. We're going to be using construction lines and basic shapes to build more complex things. So try drawing a circle using a square and construction lines now. If you'd like, use your ruler or T-square, then draw your subject the circle freehand. You'll note that Akins did just that. One hint, draw the construction lines light and thin. Try a well-pointed 2H or 4H pencil, then use an HB or 2B for the circle itself. Now you're ready to draw more shapes. Start with a right triangle. Then 2 right triangles back to back. Then that same shape without the center line. Now, make another with its mirror image and you get a diamond. Flip it on its side, you'll get a parallelogram. Return to the diamond construction, but point the triangle down, the lower up, and you get an hourglass. Back to the triangle. Chop off its top and you get a trapezoid. Stack these, a hexagon. You could invert it and then you'd get an hourglass variation. Take a circle, half it, you get a hemisphere. Condense a circle to get an ellipse, ovoid, or spheroid, and invert the sides to get a curvilinear hourglass variation. We're beginning to develop a vocabulary of shapes, and we can put them to use to draw objects. People have been using shapes in just this way for a long time. This is a page from the sketchbook of a 13th century Frenchman named Villard-Doncourt. Part of the inscription reads, "Here begins the method of representation as taught by the art of geometry." So let's adopt this method. We'll start with an object often found in still lifes, a wine bottle. We'll draw it from our imaginations, upright and seen straight on. Like many things seen this way, it's also bilaterally symmetrical. Imagine from this point of view, we can construct it using 4 simple shapes. A large rectangle for the body, a triangle for the shoulders, a small, thinner vertical rectangle for the neck, and a much smaller horizontal rectangle for the collar. 4 shapes total, 3 rectangles, and a triangle. Following Akins' example, we'll start with the center line, and that will help us control the shape symmetry. Make your center line however you like, whatever size, and then also give yourself a horizontal to represent the width of the body. But then put aside your straight edge. And what we're going to do is we'll draw a rectangle for the body. And then take a look at it and make any adjustments you need to. Then our next shape will be a triangle for the shoulders. And then we'll take that and we'll turn it into a trapezoid and make a rectangle for our neck. And you can refine your line as needed. Use the kneaded eraser to take away some of the erasure. And we'll add a final horizontal rectangle for the collar. Now we can erase our center line, we can erase some of our construction shape, erase what we don't need. And we can soften the hard corners. Get a little erasing there. And then we can just round through a little bit. Rounding at the shoulders, rounding a bit at the collar, at the top of the bottle, and on the other side. And then we'll just round a bit at the bottom, at the base of the bottle. And erase what we don't want. And we're done. Now you might ask, why not draw a bottle starting at one point and moving around its edge? Just outline it, likely the way many of you drew your initial circle. Here's the problem. When most people just follow the edge of an object, they run into a routine problem. The object's out of whack. It leans to the left or to the right, and the left and right sides don't really correspond. While this could be expressive, if we want a naturalistic result, using a center line and constructing with shape can really help. Instead, by drawing with shape on a center line, we draw the top and the bottom and the sides of the object or portion of the object in one fell swoop. So it's easier to see and control the proportions, the widths and the heights. And we'll be much more aware if there's a right-left alignment problem or if the object's tilting off a true vertical. Drawing with construction lines and building block shapes helps us see all of this much more clearly. And crucially, we haven't invested in precious details. We're just making simple shapes which are easily judged, edited, and erased. We just drew a bottle from the imagination. Let's try it now from observation. We'll be doing this often, relating imagination or construction to observation. Both are very important ways of drawing. You'll need a simple bottle, more or less like the one we just drew. Put it on your table and draw it using the same constructive method we just used. Don't worry about the label, the bottle's contents, or any other details, just a center line and shapes. We have three goals here. We want the bottle to be truly vertical, no leaning, truly symmetrical, no bulges, and proportionate to the bottle you're looking at. Take it step by step and take it slow. Leonardo da Vinci's Trattato della Pittura, or Treatise on Painting, is a compilation that was put together by one of his students, Francesco Melzi. This is back in the mid-16th century. In this treatise, Leonardo gives this advice to new students. Ti ricordo che impari prima la diligenza che la prestezza. I remind you to first learn diligence, not speed. So take the time to get each step right before going on to the next. Start with a center line, then a rectangle for the body of the object. It's just 4 lines. Check them, make sure you're centered on that center line. Then look at the height to width proportions. Make sure they correspond to the proportions of the bottle's body. If not, erase and correct. Just 4 lines. Understanding the width to height proportions may take time at first, but you'll get better with practice. You're developing a new skill. You're seeing how you can measure with your eye. When you're satisfied with your first shape, add a truncated triangle or trapezoid for the shoulders, 3 new lines. At each step, check for symmetry and proportion. Now the thin neck, 3 more lines. Add a horizontal rectangle for the collar. Now a final check for symmetry and proportion. Part of learning to see involves analyzing what we're seeing and breaking complex things down into understandable pieces. In this case, simple constituent shapes. While the end goal of drawing is often expression, it has its distinctly quantitative side, especially if we want the result to be naturalistic. Relative proportions, angles, and distances all have to be carefully determined. As will become abundantly clear in coming lectures, a lot of this relates to measure of one kind or another. We put something down, we look analytically, measuring size, placement, degree of symmetry, and a host of other variables. Then we edit, correct, and adjust. Many would say that drawing is not so much an action as a process. Part of that process involves coming to a visual understanding of what we're seeing or imagining and drawing. With that in mind, let's up the ante and use our vocabulary of shapes to construct some more challenging subjects. This is a still life, a 1996 pencil drawing by the contemporary American artist William Bailey. And it's like the Aikens, complex. But using what we've learned about drawing construction lines and shapes, we'll be able to get a pretty good handle on how we might begin to go about drawing the kind of objects we see in this still life. And don't worry if things don't come out as precisely as you like at first. I've been drawing for decades and often feel the same way. I'll often use my erasers as often as my pencils, if not more. If you can tolerate a bit of awkwardness and summon your patience and persistence, you'll see real improvement. This is just the first step. Stick with it and practice. You'll see your ability develop. And in the coming lectures, we'll be studying specific methods for getting all those proportions to correspond with what we see. Let's draw the central picture. First, we'll draw a light vertical center construction line. You might want to use a straight edge like Aikens, but draw the rest freehand. Look at the picture. What shape is that body? Not much more than a slowly tapering trapezoid. So draw a similar trapezoid on your center line. 4 lines. Then eyeball the result. First in reference to the center line. Is your shape centered and bilaterally symmetrical? If not, adjust. Now, compare the shape to Bailey's. Does it have similar height to width proportions? Are the diagonals of the sides similar in angle? Adjust again. Take it slow. So only 4 lines. Next, the spout. What shape is it? Not much more than a small triangle. 2 lines, really. Then, check the placement and scale. Are the lines in the right place? Are they the right length and diagonal? If they aren't, erase and change anything that looks off. We'll tackle the handle in 2 pieces using construction shapes. First, we'll draw an oval for the top part and a downward pointing triangle for the bottom. And if we've gotten our shapes about right, the handle should more or less fall into place. Again, eyeball the results and adjust as needed. When you're satisfied, erase the construction lines. Then slightly round some of the angular edges to make it feel more naturalistic. Last, we'll add 2 light lines for the rim at the top and bottom of the picture. Let's follow the same procedure with the elaborate vase on the right. No worries, we can boil it down to 6 simple shapes, and we'll build it like a skyscraper from bottom to top. Once again, we'll start with that center line. Then a rectangle for the rounded bottom portion, 4 lines. This in part will be a guide shape. You want to hinge this rectangle on the center line and make sure it captures the height to width proportions of the bottom shape. Take a moment to eyeball it, then make any corrections you need to. Next, round out the sides. It's more or less like drawing a smiley face, smile upended. Many people also turn their paper as they draw. It's often easier to draw certain things in one position rather than another, so you could try that too. On top of the bottom rectangle, we'll add a really small rectangle, and on top of that, a section of a hemisphere with a flat bottom. Eyeball your first 3 shapes for proportion, then adjust. We'll cap the hemisphere with a triangle. These last 3 shapes taken together should look like a top. The fish shape's another rectangle, a slim vertical one. The 6th and final shape will be a downward pointing triangle. Check the proportions and all the shape's alignments with their center line. Using the top 3 shapes as a guide, draw the slightly curving sides of the vase, then erase the construction lines and round some of the angles. Last, you could add those decorative stripes. If it didn't come out quite the way you'd like, don't worry. This is a beginning. Try it a couple times and it'll improve. And it would be a great exercise to draw each of the remaining objects in the still life using the same method. Many things in our homes can be constructed using simple shapes like circles, ovals, rectangles, and triangles, especially when they're in an upright and frontal or profile view. I asked you all at the beginning of the lecture to gather up some objects, like a pitcher, a vase, a candlestick, coffee mug, or a wine glass. Put one object on your still life table. Analyze it. What constituent shapes could it be constructed with? Give yourself a center line and build your object. Check at each step for symmetricality and proportion, just like we did earlier. Many other things can be drawn the same way. Houses, cars, bicycles, furniture, fruit. vegetables, even the human figure. All this can be analyzed and drawn using these ideas. So try drawing the things around you. Once you understand the basic principle of using construction lines, contour and shape building blocks, try drawing from your imagination too. This has its parallel in writing. We can construct all the words in most languages with a finite set of letters. Even Chinese, which is pictographic, has a finite set of visual units called radicals, 214 in all. In drawing, we can construct just about all the things in the world around us with a finite set of shapes. And we can combine observation with imagination and improvisation. You could start with a bottle, using it as a model. Draw the body and shoulders just as you see them. But you could make the neck much longer or shorter, or make the body wider. So we can move from observation to construction to invention. Before moving on with the rest of the lecture, you could take some time to draw now, to practice and experiment with these approaches. So far, we've seen how contour can be used to make shape, and we've seen how we can use contour and shape with the aid of construction lines and shapes to draw a wide range of things, both from observation and from the imagination. Often, though, we're not just drawing a single thing, we're drawing groups of things, like objects and fruit in a still life, or groups of trees or other elements in a landscape, or a group of people in a room. In each case, another kind of construction shape, aggregate shape, can really help us out. One of the most common problems beginning drawing students encounter is that they run out of paper in one direction or another. They can't fit all the objects in the still life in their drawing. Or even with the single figure, they run out of room for the legs and the feet, or the neck and the head, or both. They fall off the page. Another common problem is that the objects don't relate well to one another or to the shape of the drawing itself. And this is absolutely avoidable if we adjust our procedure. When most artists draw, they're not only thinking about the individual objects or figures, they're thinking about how those things get organized. To begin to think this way, it helps to start with a large, encompassing shape instead of starting with a detail or a part of an object or figure. Earlier, we looked at this Greek amphora. There are 4 unique figures, but they're conceived of collectively. They form an aggregate shape. As much as each figure has a shape identity, the group does as well. Traveling 1,600 years forward in time, let's take another look at those court ladies preparing newly woven silk. Here too, the figures form an overall grouping, a wide rectangle that rhymes in shape with the central rectangle of the scroll itself. Within that, we find subgroupings. The 4 figures on the right and the 4 figures on the left each form a rectangular grouping. And we can conceive of the 3 central figures, with the addition of the small child on the left, as forming a house-shaped grouping, a rectangle topped by a triangle. The small child under the stretched silk actually links the central and left groups. We could also say that the far left figure in the right grouping helps link that group to the central one, because she's facing in towards them. Let's jump ahead another 200 plus years to Renaissance Italy. Leonardo's Last Supper is surprisingly similar to the Song Dynasty court ladies, in that the figures form a long rectangular grouping with clear subgroupings. Reading left to right, we can see this as a rectangular group of 6, a triangle of 1, and a rectangle of 6. Or we could also see it as a group of 3, another 3, a 1, a 3, and a final 3. And in the 16th century Holbein, well, he's thinking similarly. We get a large rectangular grouping. This time it could be subdivided as a large trapezoid receding into space and a smaller rectangle or pentagon of sorts. Moving forward a century or so, we find Rembrandt. You'll note that most of the crowd forms an aggregate rectangle with smaller rectangles on the upper right and the lower left. There are also subgroupings of interlocking rectangles and triangles. And here's a drawing from Rembrandt's contemporary, the French Nicolas Poussin. The figures on the ground group into a wide rectangle, the figures above into a square one, as do the figures between the columns of the large building in the back. Traveling to the 18th century, to India, the 2 lovers form an aggregate triangle. Next to 20th century Bologna. This is a still life by Giorgio Morandi, known very much as an artist. His still life forms an aggregate rectangle, here a vertical one. And let's return to the Bailey. The objects are grouped more or less into a long rectangle. We could also view that shape as a rectangle framed by two right triangles, a trapezoid really, or as two overlapping trapezoids. One of the things that make all these work so interesting to look at is the way we see a variety of patterns of interconnected groupings and subgroupings. What they all share is that they unite the disparate individual elements. This provides connection and solidity. It creates an abstract structure of shape that makes visual sense in the drawing. I've chosen a wide range of examples to make the point that this isn't about a style or type of art. It's a fundamental visual principle. We started out with a problem of falling off the page, not having enough room to fit things intended in the drawing. Starting with aggregate shape helps to preclude this, and it establishes strong relationships among the shapes, among the things that we want to draw. So let's try it now. You'll need a pencil, an eraser, and a sheet of 8.5 by 11-inch paper. We'll combine this new idea with what we've already learned. We'll start with a large aggregate shape to locate 3 objects in the page, then use construction lines, contour, and building block shapes to construct the objects themselves. This is what we're going to draw. There's nothing inherently special about it. It's simply a means to understand a set of procedures. We'll start with the aggregate shape, a wedge shape, taller than it's wide. We'll place it a bit off center to the right and with more white of the page below than above. We'll work from the back forward, so we'll start with a picture by drawing a tallish trapezoid in the lower right quadrant of the aggregate shape. We want to extend a bit beyond the horizontal and vertical halves of the aggregate shape in its placement. Take some time to get it in the right place. Next, add a center line, then adjust the trapezoid. Now we'll add the upper trapezoid, an inverted one, and a triangle for the spout. Then the handle. Let it extend to the aggregate shape's edge. Do this freehand, or if you prefer, use a construction shape like we did earlier. Next, the bottle. We'll draw it using 4 shapes. First, the base, aligned with the aggregate shape on the left and a bit above it horizontally. Note the relationship of the height of this rectangle relative to the picture. It's just a bit shorter. Now we'll add a center line and adjust. Then a trapezoid for the shoulders, a gently tapering neck, and a cap extending to the aggregate shape's border. We'll add a thin line under the cap for the collar. Now let's turn to the bowl. We'll start with a trapezoid for the body. Note its location, just above the bottom border of the aggregate shape. The top's above the half of the bottle's base. Also note how far it extends right and left. When you think you've got it about right, add a center line and adjust as needed. Starting about halfway down the trapezoid on either side, we'll draw a curve extending to the center point of the base, then a partial trapezoid for the bowl's base. Add a couple of decorative stripes, and we're almost there. So the first thing we'll do is to erase the aggregate shape. And then we want to imagine it in space, so we'll take our pencil and draw on a couple lines to represent the point where the tabletop is sitting against the wall. That'll place it into space. Now we have a bunch of erasing to do. Why don't we start with those center lines? We can get rid of those. In some of the tight places, I'll use my kneaded eraser. And we can get rid of some of the other construction lines and shapes, internal shapes. And we can also get rid of the pieces that are being overlapped. And we might want to do a little more erasing, especially at some of those angled edges, sharp edges, places where we're going to want to round. And then we can go back in with our pencil and begin to do some of our rounding, making things look a little more natural. And where we've lost some line, we'll just reiterate as needed. And we're pretty much done. Here's what I'd like you to do next. Gather up the drawings of individual objects you did earlier. Look through them. Imagine how 3 to 5 of the objects could be drawn together to form an aggregate shape. Then draw the imagined aggregate shape in your page. Using your earlier drawings as a reference, build your objects into that shape. After you've done this, try it from observation. Set up 3 to 5 still life objects on your table to form that aggregate shape. Draw the shape on your page, then use building block shapes and center lines and construct your drawing. Next, we'll further explore how the shapes and objects we draw relate to the page.